almost everything we do in today's world has a computer involved with it, whether it's our Facebook accounts, whether it's in our car, whether it's the OnStar system that connects our cars, and then our banking is done entirely with and financial services through electronics and computers. Actually, even today, the notion of writing checks under the ChiuKaiChen1 Act, we destroy the physical check early in the process and just rely on electronic images of the check. So everything we do has a computer involved, and that command and control system, if it's compromised, can wreak havoc. I know that actually I'll tell you one story, and that story just came to mind. I think in the mid-'80s, there was a science fiction movie that dealt with a teenager who thought he was playing a video game that involved nuclear war. And the way the story evolved was that, in fact, he had actually hacked into a Strategic Air Command computer running simulations that actually had launch control authority on nuclear missiles. All right, so that's the typical science fiction story. Well, it turns out that at that time, when the movie was released, there was a meeting of Air Force computer security folks, and they actually, the general had seen the movie, and he asked the people at the Air Force Research Lab, some of whom I worked with in the 90s, and they never forget this. The general asked, "Well, I just saw this movie. Why can't this ever happen?" Well, they didn't actually have a particularly good answer to it. And so I say this because security involves some notion of doubt in what is actually assured. And so we have one type of disaster, which is nuclear Armageddon, but let's think of another type, which I think actually we are more concerned about, and that's identity theft or the misuse of financial services electronically. And so if financial Armageddon actually happens, right? Let's say everybody's bank account disappears. Unlike nuclear Armageddon, where nobody is around to care, if financial Armageddon occurs and our institutions collapse, everybody's around and they are really hopping mad. So security actually does have an important role to play in all of in modern life.
What is the role of government?
Now let's consider the role of government. And I think one of the easiest things to consider is perhaps in building codes. And when I think about current challenges and the role of government, a current challenge is this. A colleague of mine, Gene Spafford at Purdue, who runs a very an excellent researcher, he says, there are limits to how much you can fireproof a cardboard box. And the notion is that we're living in these cardboard boxes, and that sounds pretty crazy. But if you travel around the world, sometimes you'll see these shanty towns, and in fact, San Francisco, Hong Kong, and all major cities at one time had shanty towns, and its story is typically the same, which is usually some disaster like a fire or earthquake comes through and wipes everything out, and they build from scratch. And then when they build from scratch, usually what has happened is people learn from the disaster, if it's earthquakes or fire, and they say, you know what, everybody needs to build to the same code, or at least there has to be some safety standard. So today, one of the challenges is we really are living in a digital shantytown. We have erected these ad hoc structures. We then have connected them together with many times some usually beneficial, but sometimes unforeseen results. And like trying to line up holes in Swiss cheese, we're not exactly sure where all the holes are relative to one another, and sometimes some very bad things could happen. So government, I think, needs to say what the minimum safety and security standards are. And if you think of it, there's a lot of talk about digital Pearl Harbors and things of that nature. Read Joel Brenner's book, America the Vulnerable. And in there, if you look at current policy, and you contrast cyber warfare policy with just routine, I shouldn't say routine war, but previous notions of war, is that it didn't matter in previous wars that if somebody dropped a bomb on a bank or on your house or on a military installation, the government was responsible for defending and prosecuting the war that would result from that attack. But if you look at cybersecurity policy, right, there's a very clear distinction between attacks on civil infrastructure, financial infrastructure, commercial infrastructure versus military infrastructure. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? And I think part of the reason is because the infrastructure itself is so flimsy, and the military itself cannot really realistically defend everything, cannot defend the entire country. So just like builders would have a temporarily unfair advantage if let's say you built to earthquake and fire codes and I didn't, I'd be able to sell a house more cheaply. That's true, and I might get more business, but in the end we want we want your house that meets code and in terms of fire and let's say flood and earthquakes. And that is the role of government, to say what the minimum standards are. Yes, well, let's just stick to financial services. And so the banks will remain unnamed, except that I think a contemporary example of this is Société Générale in France a couple of years ago actually collapsed because a rogue trader transferred out, I gather, several hundreds of euros, which caused the collapse of the entire company. So this is an example of agents or people having more authority or more privileges to do financial transactions that was warranted or justified in a particular case. And so the real challenge is, and this is an integrity challenge as opposed to a confidentiality challenge, is that was the person or is the person authorized to take the action that they're proposing to take? And that's true of any command and control situation. This is seemingly simple to say yes or no to, but remember, when you have large customers, lots of dollars involved, and we do not see each other face to face, we are relying on old habits, electronic representations, and frankly, whims sometimes in letting a transaction go through. And so what happens is a large financial services organization will have thousands of employees who've maybe been all over the place, have accumulated many, many different privileges, and it's hard to manage. I mean, so let's say you're a manager that has 500 employees, and you are asked, here is a list of 500 employees and everything they're able to do. Is it appropriate? And I can tell you from one major banking organization is that what typically is done is what we all probably would do, is they ask ourselves, well, what did the person do last year? Did they have the same privilege or about the same privileges, and has their job description really changed that much? And if not, okay, seems good. And we would let it go through. And so you can imagine, after a couple of reviews, managers changing or applications changing, that pretty soon you lose precise and accurate detail to what any one individual is able to do in total, what their entire set of privileges are. And then you're, as Soc General illustrates, we're vulnerable. Again, the Bradley Manning case with WikiLeaks, there's a very, very low-level person with probably too many privileges, and then the machines had capabilities, in excess of capabilities that they required to do the job, and that set of events conspired into one of the largest leaks of confidential information. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not that was a good thing. I am saying that if your purpose is to keep that information secure and not disclose it, that things like this, small things, can have devastating results.